A cold November morning in 1952, somewhere in the heart of London, a well-dressed businessman walks into a corner shop on Oxford Street, reaches for a Cadbury chocolate bar, drops a few coins on the counter, and walks out without a second thought. Simple transaction, right? Wrong. Because that chocolate bar, that innocent piece of sweetness wrapped in purple foil, was the end product of a system so deliberately designed, so carefully orchestrated, that it would shape the fate of an entire continent for generations to come. But how could something as simple as chocolate hold such power? How could the price stamped on a wrapper in a London shop become a weapon that determined whether African children would eat or starve, whether nations would prosper or remain perpetually poor? The answer lies not in the chocolate itself, but in the bean, the cocoa bean, and in a place the British once called the Gold Coast, a name that promised riches but delivered something far more complicated. Let me take you back to the forests of what would become Ghana, back to a time when the world was rebuilding itself from the ashes of the most devastating war in human history, back to the moment when the rules of a new economic order were being written, rules that most people never saw, never questioned, and certainly never understood. This is not a story of villains in black hats or heroes in shining armor. This is a story about systems, about how power works when it doesn't announce itself, about how empires evolved from territorial conquest to something far more insidious, economic control disguised as partnership. And it all begins with a bean. In the early 20th century, the British colony known as the Gold Coast was indeed rich in gold. But by the 1920s, something else was growing in those tropical forests, something that would prove far more valuable to the British Empire than any precious metal. Cocoa. The Theobroma cacao tree, food of the gods in ancient Greek, thrived in the humid climate. Local farmers, many of whom had been growing subsistence crops for generations, began to see opportunity. They planted cocoa trees, they learned to ferment and dry the beans, they organized themselves into cooperatives, and they produced cocoa, lots of it. By the 1930s, the Gold Coast had become the world's largest cocoa producer. Ghanaian farmers were responsible for nearly 40% of global cocoa production. Their beans were shipped to Britain, to Europe, to chocolate factories that turned those bitter brown seeds into the candy that filled shop windows across the industrialized world. You might think this would have made Ghana rich. You might imagine gleaming cities, thriving industries, prosperity flowing back to the people whose labor made it all possible. You would be wrong. Because there was a problem that British colonial administrators understood very well, even if they never said it out loud in polite company. The problem was this: what happens when the colonized become economically independent? What happens when they stop needing you? The British had spent centuries extracting wealth from their colonies, first through slavery, then through direct resource extraction, then through forced labor and taxation. But by the mid-20th century, the old methods were becoming unseemly. The world was changing. The United Nations had been formed. Words like self-determination and sovereignty were in the air. Direct colonial rule was becoming harder to justify. But economic control? That was a different matter entirely. That could be dressed up as partnership, as trade agreements, as mutual benefit, as preferential access to markets. And so, as the Second World War drew to a close and the British Empire began its slow, managed retreat from direct political control, a new system was being designed, a system that would ensure the wealth kept flowing in the right direction, even after independence flags were raised and colonial governors sailed home. The cocoa bean would be central to that system. But first, we need to understand what happened in those crucial years between 1945 and 1957, the years when the old world order collapsed and a new one was carefully, deliberately constructed in its place. August 6, 1945. A single aircraft appears in the sky above Hiroshima, Japan. At 8:15 a.m., a uranium bomb nicknamed Little Boy detonates approximately 600 meters above the city center.
In an instant, 80,000 people are incinerated. The blast is so powerful that it creates a fireball hotter than the surface of the sun. Shadows of human beings are permanently burned into concrete walls, the only trace left of lives that existed just moments before. 3 days later, it happens again. Nagasaki, a plutonium bomb called Fat Man, another 40,000 people dead in seconds. By the end of 1945, the death toll from both bombs would exceed 200,000 when you count those who died slowly from radiation poisoning, their bodies betraying them cell by cell, day by day, in hospital beds where doctors could do nothing but watch. Japan surrendered on August 15, 1945. The Second World War was over. But what kind of world was left behind? Europe was in ruins. Cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to rubble. In Germany, women formed rubble brigades, chains of hands passing broken bricks, clearing streets, trying to find something salvageable in the wreckage. In Berlin, people lived in cellars beneath destroyed buildings, burning furniture to stay warm through the winter of 1945-1946. The death toll was almost incomprehensible. 60 to 80 million people dead. The Soviet Union alone had lost 27 million, nearly 15% of its entire population. Poland lost 6 million, almost 20% of its people. Germany lost 7 million. Entire Jewish communities across Europe had been systematically exterminated. The Nazi death machine had murdered 6 million Jews in concentration camps designed specifically for industrial-scale killing. Auschwitz, Treblinka, Sobibor, names that would forever represent humanity's capacity for organized evil. And now, in the smoking ruins of this catastrophe, the victors gathered to decide what came next. Two powers emerged dominant from the war: the United States and the Soviet Union. Allies during the conflict, but ideologically opposed. Capitalism versus communism, democracy versus authoritarian state control. Europe, broken and exhausted, sat between them like a prize to be claimed. The Americans understood something crucial. Desperate people make radical choices. Hungry people, cold people, people with nothing left to lose, these people are susceptible to revolutionary promises. And in 1945, Europe was full of such people. The communist parties in France and Italy were gaining strength. In the Soviet-occupied zones of Germany and Eastern Europe, new governments were being installed, governments that would orbit Moscow, not Washington or London. The American Secretary of State, George Marshall, proposed a solution: massive economic aid to rebuild Europe. The Marshall Plan, announced in June 1947, would eventually provide over $13 billion, roughly equivalent to $150 billion in today's currency, to European nations. But this wasn't charity. This was strategy. The aid came with conditions. It required recipient countries to cooperate with each other economically. It encouraged the formation of European institutions that would facilitate trade and mutual dependence. It tied European recovery to American economic interests, creating markets for American goods and establishing a transatlantic economic order that would benefit the United States for decades to come.
And it worked. Western Europe began to rebuild. Cities rose from the rubble. Factories reopened. The European coal and steel community was formed in 1951, the first step toward what would eventually become the European Union. But while Europe rebuilt with American dollars, another drama was unfolding, one that would shape the second half of the 20th century and beyond. The Iron Curtain was descending. Winston Churchill gave it a name in March 1946, speaking in Fulton, Missouri. From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an Iron Curtain has descended across the continent. Europe was being divided. The Soviet Union controlled the East. Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Romania, Bulgaria, East Germany. These nations became satellite states, their governments answering to Moscow, their economies centrally planned, their borders sealed. The West, France, Britain, Italy, West Germany, and others, aligned with the United States, adopted market economies and prepared for what everyone understood was coming, a long, bitter confrontation between two incompatible visions of how human society should be organized. The Cold War had begun. It would never become a direct military confrontation between the superpowers. The nuclear weapons demonstrated at Hiroshima and Nagasaki made that too dangerous. Instead, it would be fought through proxy wars, espionage, propaganda, and economic competition. And here's where our story about chocolate begins to connect with the grand sweep of history. Because as European powers reluctantly began to release their grip on colonial territories in Africa and Asia, both Cold War blocs saw opportunity. These newly independent nations represented potential allies, potential markets, potential resources. The question was, how do you ensure that a newly independent nation in Africa doesn't align with your ideological enemy? How do you maintain influence without the appearance of colonialism? The answer for the Western powers was economic integration, trade agreements, preferential access to markets, development aid tied to specific conditions. And for Britain, with its vast colonial empire beginning to crack apart, the question was particularly urgent. How do you maintain economic benefit from territories you can no longer directly control? The Gold Coast, soon to be independent Ghana, provided a test case, a laboratory for a new kind of relationship between former colonizer and former colony. And the cocoa bean would be the instrument of that relationship. Here's what most people don't understand about how economic control actually works in the post-colonial era. It's not about stealing resources at gunpoint anymore. That's crude, obvious, easy to condemn and resist. Instead, it's about creating systems where the terms of trade are so carefully structured that wealth flows in predictable directions without anyone having to acknowledge what's really happening.
Let me explain how this worked with cocoa. Ghana produced cocoa beans, raw, unprocessed bitter seeds that required significant processing before they could become chocolate. The beans needed to be roasted, ground, mixed with sugar and milk, tempered, and molded. This processing added enormous value. A ton of raw cocoa beans in 1950 might sell for about 200 pounds on the international market. But that same ton of beans, once processed into chocolate bars, could generate 2,000 pounds or more in retail value. Who captured that difference? Who benefited from that value addition? Not the Ghanaian farmers who grew the beans, not the Ghanaian economy that could have built processing facilities and created skilled jobs. The chocolate factories were in Britain, in Belgium, in Switzerland. The processing happened in industrial facilities in Europe and North America. Ghana shipped raw beans. Europe shipped back finished chocolate products, often to be sold in Ghana and other African nations at premium prices. This is what economists call the commodity trap. You export raw materials, import finished goods, and the terms of trade are structured so that you remain perpetually on the losing side of the transaction. But how do you lock a country into this arrangement, especially when that country is about to become independent and could theoretically build its own chocolate factories? This is where the genius, and I use that word with a bitter taste, of the post-war British economic strategy becomes apparent.
In 1957, the Gold Coast became Ghana, the first sub-Saharan African colony to achieve independence. Kwame Nkrumah, a charismatic leader who had studied in the United States and Britain, became prime minister and later president. Nkrumah understood the economic trap. He saw how colonial economies had been structured to extract wealth. He spoke openly about the need for African nations to industrialize, to add value to their own raw materials, to break free from dependence on European markets and European processing. But he faced a problem. Britain offered Ghana something that looked, on the surface, like a good deal: preferential access to British markets for Ghanaian cocoa. This meant that Ghanaian beans would enter Britain with lower tariffs than cocoa from other countries. Ghana would have a competitive advantage in selling to British chocolate manufacturers. Sounds reasonable, right? Sounds like Britain was actually helping its former colony. But here's what the preferential access agreement actually meant. First, to maintain this preferential access, Ghana had to keep exporting raw beans. Any attempt to process cocoa domestically and export finished chocolate products would lose the preferential treatment. The agreement specifically favored raw commodity exports. Second, the preferential access created economic dependence. Ghanaian cocoa farmers came to rely on the British market. Their livelihoods depended on maintaining this relationship. Any attempt to diversify markets or build domestic processing capacity risked losing access to their primary buyer. Third, and most importantly, the price of cocoa was not determined by Ghana. It was determined by markets in London, where British buyers and international commodity traders set the rates. Ghanaian farmers were price takers, not price makers. Imagine you're a cocoa farmer in Ghana in 1960. You've worked your land for decades, you've planted trees that take 5 years to mature. You've invested everything in cocoa production because that's what the market demands. Now imagine someone else, someone sitting in an office in London, someone who has never set foot in your country, someone who has never felt the weight of a cocoa pod in their hands, decides what your labor is worth. They decide whether you can afford to send your children to school this year. They decide whether you can repair your roof before the rainy season. They decide whether you eat well or barely scrape by. And there's nothing you can do about it except accept the price offered and hope it's enough. This is structural dependency. This is how economic control works when it's sophisticated enough to survive the end of formal colonialism. But it gets worse. In the early 1960s, Nkrumah's government attempted to do exactly what the British feared: build Ghana's own chocolate processing industry. The logic was simple. Why should Ghana export raw beans for 200 pounds per ton, only to import finished chocolate products for 10 times that price? Why not capture that value addition at home? Ghana had the raw materials. It had the workforce. With proper investment, it could have the facilities and expertise. Several initiatives were launched. A state-owned chocolate factory was proposed. Technical partnerships with European firms were explored. Development loans were sought. But every path forward hit obstacles that seemed almost designed to prevent success. European chocolate manufacturers, who depended on cheap raw cocoa from Africa, had no interest in helping Ghana become a competitor. Technical expertise was withheld. Equipment was sold at inflated prices. Patents and proprietary processes were protected jealously. International development banks, influenced by British and American interests, were reluctant to fund projects that would compete with established European industries. Loans were denied or came with conditions that made them impractical. And the Preferential Access Agreement? It created a perverse incentive. Building domestic chocolate manufacturing would jeopardize Ghana's favored position in exporting raw beans to Britain. The country faced a choice: maintain the current dependent relationship or risk economic disruption by trying to industrialize. Most devastating of all was the price mechanism. Here's how it worked. When Ghana attempted to withhold cocoa from the market to build up stocks for domestic processing, British buyers simply purchased more cocoa from Ivory Coast, Nigeria, or Cameroon. The competition among African producers kept prices low. If Ghana tried to charge more for its beans to fund industrialization, buyers went elsewhere. The individual producer nations had no leverage. They competed against each other for the same markets, driving down the price of their own labor and resources.
This is called the race to the bottom, and it's a feature, not a bug, of how global commodity markets are structured. By the mid-1960s, Ghana's chocolate industrialization efforts had largely failed. The country remained a raw cocoa exporter. The chocolate factories stayed in Europe. And that Cadbury bar in the London shop? Still made from Ghanaian beans processed in British factories, sold at prices set in British boardrooms. The system held. But Britain was not working alone in constructing this new economic order. The entire European project, what would become the European Union, was being built on foundations that included very specific relationships with former colonies. In 1957, the same year Ghana gained independence, 6 European nations signed the Treaty of Rome, creating the European Economic Community, EEC. The founding members were France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. The treaty established a common market, reducing trade barriers between member states and beginning the long process of European economic integration. But embedded in that treaty was something most people never heard about: provisions for association of overseas territories and former colonies with the EEC. What did association mean in practice? It meant that African, Caribbean, and Pacific nations, the ACP countries as they became known, would have special trading relationships with the European Economic Community. They would receive development aid, they would have preferential access to European markets for their raw commodities. In exchange, they would grant European companies favorable conditions for investment. They would maintain open markets for European manufactured goods. They would remain integrated into an economic system centered in Europe. This was formalized through a series of agreements, the first being the Yaoundé Convention in 1963, later replaced by the Lomé Convention in 1975. The language of these agreements was about partnership, development, mutual benefit. The reality was more complex.
European nations got guaranteed access to raw materials: cocoa from Ghana, coffee from Kenya, cotton from Mali, copper from Zambia. They got markets for their manufactured goods. They got influence over economic policy in dozens of nations across 3 continents. ACP nations got aid, technical assistance, and preferential market access for their commodities, but not for processed goods, not for manufactured products that might compete with European industries. The architecture was elegant. It allowed European nations to maintain economic relationships with their former colonies without the political burden of direct colonial rule. It created a framework of dependency that would last for decades, evolving and adapting as political conditions changed. And it all came together during those crucial years between 1945 and 1975, when the post-war order was being established, when the Cold War made African and Asian nations valuable as allies, when the old empires were giving way to something new, but not necessarily more just. None of this happened in a vacuum. The European approach to former colonies was deeply influenced by Cold War calculations. The Soviet Union was offering an alternative model to developing nations: central planning, state ownership of industry, rapid industrialization through government direction rather than market forces. And importantly, the Soviets were willing to provide aid without the strings attached to Western assistance. They built factories in Africa. They trained technicians. They offered ideological support for anti-colonial movements. For Western powers, particularly Britain and France with their extensive colonial histories, this represented a genuine threat. What if newly independent African nations aligned with Moscow? What if they nationalized European-owned assets? What if they closed their markets to Western goods and turned to communist economic models? The ACP framework was, in part, an answer to that threat.
By offering preferential market access and development aid, European nations aimed to keep former colonies within their economic orbit. By structuring the terms of trade to favor raw commodity exports, they created dependencies that made radical economic reorientation difficult. Ghana, under Nkrumah, provides a perfect example of how this played out. Nkrumah was not a communist, but he was sympathetic to socialist economic policies. He sought aid from both East and West. He attempted to build state-owned industries. He spoke at conferences of non-aligned nations about economic independence and African unity. The British were deeply concerned. If Ghana succeeded in building an independent, industrialized economy outside Western control, it could serve as a model for other African nations. The whole careful architecture of post-colonial economic relationships might unravel. So obstacles appeared. Loans were harder to secure. Technical assistance was withheld. Cocoa prices fell when Ghana attempted to withhold supplies to build up domestic processing capacity. In 1966, while Nkrumah was out of the country, a military coup overthrew his government. The new regime was far more amenable to Western economic interests. State industrialization projects were abandoned. The cocoa trade returned to its established patterns. Was the coup directly orchestrated by Western intelligence services? The evidence remains disputed, though CIA documents later released suggest at minimum knowledge of and tacit approval for the plotters. What's undisputable is this: the coup removed the greatest obstacle to maintaining British economic influence in Ghana. The chocolate factories that might have been built never materialized. The system held. And across Africa, leaders learned a lesson: push too hard for genuine economic independence, challenge the fundamental structure of the international trading system, and you might find yourself removed from power.
The examples accumulated. Patrice Lumumba in the Congo, assassinated with Belgian and American involvement. Thomas Sankara in Burkina Faso, killed in a coup after attempting radical economic reforms. Salvador Allende in Chile, overthrown by a CIA-backed military coup after nationalizing copper mines. The message was clear. You could have political independence. You could have your flag and your national anthem and your seat at the United Nations. But economic independence, that was a different matter entirely. Fast forward to today, Ghana is still one of the world's largest cocoa producers. Ghanaian farmers still grow the beans that become chocolate bars sold in shops across Europe and North America. And Ghana still exports primarily raw cocoa beans, not finished chocolate products. 70 years after independence, the fundamental structure of the relationship has not changed. Why?
because the patterns established in those crucial post-war decades created path dependencies that are extraordinarily difficult to break. Ghanaian farmers organized their cultivation around export markets. Infrastructure was built to move raw beans from farms to ports, not to domestic processing facilities. Education and training systems developed expertise in agriculture, not in food processing or manufacturing. International trade agreements, many still based on frameworks established during the colonial and early post-colonial period, continue to favor raw commodity exports from Africa, while European and American agricultural subsidies make it difficult for African processed goods to compete.
The price-setting mechanisms remain largely unchanged. Cocoa prices are still determined on commodity exchanges in London and New York, not in Accra or Abidjan. And perhaps most importantly, the multinational corporations that dominate the global chocolate industry, companies like Mondelez, Mars, Nestle, and Ferrero, have no incentive to see this system change. They profit enormously from purchasing cheap raw materials and capturing the value addition in their own facilities. Today, cocoa farmers in Ghana and Ivory Coast, which together produce about 60% of the world's cocoa, earn roughly 6% of the final retail value of chocolate products made from their beans. 6%. The other 94% is captured by processors, manufacturers, distributors, and retailers, almost all located in wealthy nations in Europe and North America. This is the bitter taste of London's gold. This is what those post-war trade agreements and economic frameworks created, not through conspiracy or cartoon villainy, but through carefully constructed systems that appeared reasonable, even generous on the surface, while ensuring that wealth continued to flow in the same directions it had always flowed. So what do we take away from this story? First, that the end of formal colonialism did not mean the end of colonial economic relationships. Those relationships simply evolved, became more sophisticated, learned to speak the language of partnership while maintaining structures of dependency. Second, that the post-war order, the institutions and agreements created between 1945 and 1975, were not neutral or natural. They were deliberately designed by the powerful to maintain their advantages in a changing world.
The Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe, yes, but it also tied European recovery to American economic interests and created transatlantic dependencies that persist today. The European Economic Community began a process of integration that eventually became the EU, but it also formalized relationships with former colonies that locked those nations into roles as commodity exporters and consumers of European manufactured goods. The ACP framework offered development assistance and preferential market access, but it structured that assistance to prevent genuine industrialization and economic independence. Third, that the Cold War provided both the context and the justification for these systems. The need to prevent newly independent nations from aligning with the Soviet Union gave urgency to creating frameworks of economic dependency dressed up as partnership. And fourth, that individual people, farmers in Ghana, workers in chocolate factories in Britain, consumers purchasing candy bars in corner shops, were often unaware of the larger systems they participated in. The farmer growing cocoa didn't choose to be locked into a global commodity market that undervalued his labor. He was born into that system, and breaking free was nearly impossible. The factory worker in Birmingham processing cocoa beans didn't design the trade agreements that ensured those beans came cheaply from Africa rather than being processed there. He just showed up to work and did his job. The consumer buying a chocolate bar had no idea that the price on the wrapper represented the endpoint of a system of structured inequality that stretched back decades. that connected to the Marshall Plan and the Iron Curtain and the mushroom clouds over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And yet, all of these people were connected. Their fates were intertwined by decisions made in rooms they never entered, by agreements written in languages of economics and diplomacy that they never studied, by systems that operated invisibly in the background of their daily lives.
This is how power works in the modern world, not through obvious domination, but through complex systems that become normalized, that seem natural, that are so deeply embedded they become almost invisible. The next time you see a chocolate bar in a shop, I want you to think about that. Think about the journey of those cocoa beans. Think about the farmer who grew them and what portion of the price you're paying actually makes it back to him. Think about the post-war order that created the trading systems determining that price. Think about the Marshall Plan and the Iron Curtain and the bombs that fell on Japan and the rubble brigades in Berlin. Think about how all of it connects. How the grand sweep of history, world wars and superpowers and ideological confrontations shapes the most mundane aspects of our daily lives. Because that chocolate bar, that simple pleasure, carries within it the weight of empire, the legacy of colonialism, the persistence of inequality, and the complexity of a global economic order built during the most transformative decades of the 20th century. That's the bitter taste behind the sweetness. That's the story of London's gold.